Okay, let's get started. We've only got an hour today. Hello, everyone. For those of you whom I don't know, I'm Steve Ehrenberg. My team and I organize the public events at Rotman. Thank you all for coming. It's my great pleasure to introduce Seung Chan Lim. He goes by Slim. Slim flew up today from his home in Providence, Rhode Island to be with us. He's a graduate of the Rhode Island School of Design. He's the author of the award-winning book, Realizing Empathy, An Inquiry into the Meaning of Making. Many of you have a copy in front of you. As a designer, researcher, and artist, Slim integrates 15 years of cross-disciplinary experience. He consults, speaks, writes, and leads workshops all over the planet on how to realize, develop, and facilitate empathy. I think we're all in for a treat. Slim, the room is yours. Thanks for doing this.
All designers do is make stuff look pretty. That's what I told my computer science advisor in college. I was 21 and very arrogant. But then I got a chance to work at a local design firm for the next almost 10 years of my life. And I practiced something that is now called human-centered design. And I quickly realized how prejudiced I'd been. What's interesting is there's a pattern in my life, and that is whenever I'm encountering something that I'm unfamiliar with, that makes me feel uncomfortable, I have this intense desire to judge it, and sometimes in a negative way, just like design. But when I'm given an opportunity to learn about that seemingly pejorative endeavor, chances are good that I often find how prejudiced I'd been. Because even after design, I decided to pick another discipline to put down. And this time, it was art. I said, design is good, it's useful, noble, but art, that just seems useless. Why would you ever want to do that? But then I got a chance to spend the next 4 years of my life at Rhode Island School of Design and Brown University studying both visual and performing arts. And once again, I learned how prejudiced I'd been. But thankfully, that's not all I learned. I also learned that at the heart of what we call the creative process is what I now call realizing empathy. And that's what I want to talk about today. There are really three things I want to cover tonight. The first is the word empathy itself, because it's become a buzzword. And what that means is there's more misunderstanding than ever, a lot of confusions. So I want to make sure that I'm clear as to what I mean by empathy. Second thing I want to talk about is the relationship between empathy and learning. I believe that empathy is often framed as a means of, as in the context of morality. As in, it's something that you should do because it's good, it's right. But I think there's a tremendous amount of value in learning that's related to empathy. So I want to make sure that I cover that. And finally, I want to talk about the relationship between empathy and the creative process itself. So about 10 years ago, I had a close friend who was suffering from bipolar depression. Does everybody know what bipolar depression is? Does anybody not know what bipolar depression is? Okay. And it was about 3 years out of college for me, which meant that I had just been trained as a computer scientist. And what that meant was I was an excellent problem solver. So I wanted to naturally solve my friend's problem, right? So I went online, read everything there was about depression. I read books, magazines, articles, you name it. I read them all. And then I went to a local support group to get some practical advice. And there was a psychiatrist there. And I said, please teach me how to solve depression. And she said, well, it's not that easy, but here are some things you could try. And I said, okay, tell me. And she said, the next time your friend gets depressed, sit down with her and listen to her very closely. And if you think you can understand how she's feeling and why, reflect that back to her. And if your understanding is correct, she'll feel understood, and that'll make her feel better. And I was like, oh, I can do that. That sounds super easy. And then I tried it. The whole time I was trying to listen to her, she kept yelling, screaming, and crying. She told me that I did not understand. So what was I supposed to do? I kept revising my story over and over and over again, hoping I would eventually get it right. But I couldn't. Maybe half an hour passed by with absolutely no idea what it was that I was missing. But then I came to a rude awakening, because it occurred to me that maybe something I had said earlier in the day had something to do with her feeling the way she was feeling now. So I told her that. And like magic, she stopped yelling, screaming, and crying as she sat there sobbing. Now, what I realized at that moment was that everything I'd been telling her up to that point was framed in such a way that it was all her fault. And I had nothing to do with it. Because she was supposed to be the problem, and I was supposed to be the problem solver. How can the problem solver be a part of the problem? It can't. In fact, I started off thinking I already knew the answer, or the solution. And it was so simple. She just had to cheer up. I thought if I could logically explain this to her, that she would snap out of her depression, and that would solve her problem. But in hindsight, this was not the case. If anybody had to snap out of it, it was me. But what's remarkable is that once I realized this, I couldn't understand why I hadn't thought of this simple solution before. Because it made complete sense to me what was going on inside her. And there was something even more remarkable that happened, which is that she thanked me. I was completely surprised. I didn't know I could be thanked for trying to listen to someone and reflecting back my understanding. And to this day, all the work I do on empathy reflects this very instance and stems across all the different things I'm going to talk about today. Now, I want you to take a moment to imagine what it might have been like for me to go through that process of trying to listen to her and reflecting back my understanding. Imagine what kind of milestone were in that process that stepped me through that process. And now, with that in mind, let's talk about the word empathy. So the word empathy, in the story I just told, I started off not empathizing with my friend. Or more technically speaking, I sympathized with her, which is to say that I felt sorry for her. And that's why I wanted to help. Now, by the end of the story, I ended up empathizing with my friend. And by that, I mean that I had an experience where I felt as if I were embodying or understanding the context of my friend. And there was a quality of resonance. And more colloquially said, there's a quality of oneness that I experienced at that moment. Now, what the word empathy tries to do is it tries to explain how it is that we go from point A to point B. How do we go from not empathizing to empathizing? Right? That's what empathy tries to do. Now, the actual explanation of how that happens, there are many scientists who would argue for different reasons how this happens. Some people say it's because we can catch other people's emotion. Some people say it's because we have a theory of mind. Other people say it's just this magic thing called the mirror neuron. Just explains it all. Now, I don't think any one of those things can quite explain the entirety of this complex phenomena. But I do want to make clear that when I use the word empathy, what I'm referring to is that word that tries to explain how it is that we go from not empathizing to empathizing. And I want to add one more word, and that word is realizing empathy. And that's the process that we take to go from point A to point B. So to recap, empathy is what explains how we go from point A to point B. Empathizing is the experience we have. And realizing empathy is the process of going from point A to point B. Now, does anybody have any questions about those things at this point? Okay? So let's move on to the second topic. Empathy and learning. There are actually two different ways in which empathy can be realized. The first is that it can be realized automatically or involuntarily for you. Just imagine a time when you're watching a movie and you can instantly connect with a character. Or if you're like me, you're in the shower and all of a sudden, something your mother told you 20 years ago, all of a sudden makes sense. I mean, this has happened to most of us. These are cases in which empathy is realized for you involuntarily. There's no effort required. It's like pushing a ball downhill. But there's another way, and that is to realize empathy deliberately. Imagine a time when you're reading a book and you have to proactively imagine what the character is going through. Now also imagine, even if you imagine, you can't quite understand what's going on inside the character. Or maybe your friend, or somebody you like, or somebody you are acquainted with. Or what if you're in a disagreement with somebody? What if you're reading a news and you think that person is evil? In these cases, empathy is not going to realize for you involuntarily. You have to realize it deliberately. It's like pushing a ball uphill. Now, I want you to take a moment to remember the last time you were having trouble realizing empathy. Now, show of hands if you can remember an instance like that. Most of us. I want you to ponder the possibility that whenever you have trouble realizing empathy, there's always some kind of conflict in that relationship. Now, I mean something very subtle by conflict. I don't mean fistfights, and I don't mean that kind of conflict. But let me explain. And this kind of conflict that I'm talking about can only be resolved if three conditions are met. First is that you actually have to be aware that there even is a conflict. The second is that you actually have to care enough to want to resolve this conflict. And finally, you need to have the ability to locate and resolve this conflict. But here's the thing. If you remember back to the story of me and my friend, what do you think was the conflict? Think about that for a second. Because this is what I thought the conflict was. I thought the conflict was between me having a wonderful solution and my friend unwilling to accept my wonderful solution. That's what I thought the conflict was. What this means is that when you're having trouble realizing empathy, the conflict is usually invisible to you. You don't know what the conflict is. And that's one of the most difficult aspects of what makes realizing empathy so difficult. But I want to not focus so much on the conflict resolution aspect, but I want to talk about what happens during the effort of trying to resolve that conflict. And that is that you learn a new choice. A new choice of being impressed and expressing. Now, those are weird words, I know, so let me explain what I mean by that. Back in art school, one of the first classes I took was called Drawing from Observation. Has anybody drawn from observation before? Oh, wow, this is going to be great. So before I took this class, I've never drawn in my entire life, or not being taught how to draw in my entire life. So understandably, I drew like crap. So we were in this class, and we had nude models come in, and we're supposed to draw them. And here I was drawing like crap. So I raised my hand and said, "Teacher, please come teach me how to draw." So I thought it was a natural request. Teacher came over and said, "What's the problem, Slim?" And I said, "Well, I can't draw, so you need to teach me how to draw." And she's like, "Oh, that's interesting. Well, I think the problem isn't so much that you don't know how to draw technically, but you're not seeing the model." And I was like, "What are you talking about? Like, there's the model. I'm looking at the model and I'm drawing. Like, what exactly can I not be seeing?" He's like, "Well, I don't think you understand. You have to see the model before you can draw." And I just couldn't understand what she was talking about. What's worse is she said, "That's all I'm going to tell you." And she just walked away. And I'm like, I'm paying money for this class? So I was extremely frustrated. And this went on for weeks. Just me drawing horribly. Kept on drawing horribly. And nobody's teaching me anything. But at the 8th week mark, something happened to me. And it occurred that she was right. Because it occurred to me, or I became aware of the fact that the moment I look at somebody, there's an image in my head that tries to draw a shape of what it is that I'm looking at. And when I try to draw, I was actually trying to translate that shape in my head onto newsprint. I was like, oh, is that what she means? So at that moment, I deliberately tried not to do that, or try to directly translate the experience of seeing the model onto newsprint. And this is what came out. This is the first time in my entire life where I drew something that remotely resembled what was actually in front of me. And this happened in a matter of minutes. Well, yes, I went through the whole process of drawing like crap, which I believe has something to do with it. But the decisive moment was the moment when I realized that I was not seeing what's in front of me. I want to think about this, because this is what I mean by learning a new choice. Actually, two new choices. The first choice is the choice of how you can be impressed by another, which is how you can see, experience, and understand them differently. And then the second choice is then, based on that impression, how can you reflect on that and change the way you express? These are new choices I did not know I had before. And this is the kind of learning that happens when you realize empathy. And a lot of times it can be paradigm shifting, as it was for me in the drawing class. Because I started going like, what am I not seeing? What else am I? Just it's a whole new world. Right? To this day, I can choose how I see whatever is in front of me. It's a distinct choice you can learn. Now, let me make a smaller example, or simpler example, to break this down so that it's easier to understand. There are 3 distinct stages that you go through when you're realizing empathy. And that is association, conversation, and bisociation. So what's an association? What's your name? Gonzalo. Let's pretend that we've been longtime friends. And we have a long history together. But we haven't seen each other for, say, 15 years. And by chance, I meet you on the street. And I look at you, and you look at me, and I'm surprised, and I say, hi. Now, without thinking too much, what do you think, what would you associate that word hi with?
I'm surprised to see you, or it's been a while.
Some kind of a greeting, right? Which is a natural association we make. And this is something we do every day on a regular basis. We perceive some kind of signal, and we immediately associate it with something that we think is familiar. Right? And we narrow this down by the context, which is that guy, I know that person, it's on the street, so it's a kind of a greeting. And this works fine until we encounter something unexpected. So for example, I said hi, and you said hi back. And what if I said, no, hi as an up high? How would that make you feel?
Taken back.
Kind of weird, right? Yeah? And that's also normal, which is perfectly fine. Now, is that kind of feeling of taken back, is it positive or negative, usually?
But I guess you could be confused, which would be a little bit negative.
Right, a little bit negative. And when we have these weird feelings like confusion or frustration or awkwardness, we typically frame it as something that's negative. And that usually translates to a problem. And when we consider something a problem, we often want to solve it immediately. We don't want to delay it until later because we want to solve it immediately. Now, do you know of a popular way to resolve that kind of weird, awkward situation? What would be a popular way to resolve that tension? Yes? Sure. Yeah. Some people would laugh. Other people would run away. An even more popular one, however, is to judge, which is to draw a boundary. For example, you can say, oh, he's weird. You're normal, I'm weird. It makes perfect sense for a weird guy to say things that are weird, right? And this is called rationalization. And this is not bad or good. This is something we're capable of doing, and we often do this for the sake of sanity. Right? The only problem with this approach is if you keep doing this, everyone around you starts being weird. And you're the only normal person in the entire planet. So this is kind of an issue. Right? So there's got to be a different way to resolve this tension besides rationalizing. So let's reframe the situation in a different way. Now, what's another way to think about this kind of situation, but not as a problem, but as something else? Does anybody know? What I'm looking for is a paradox. So, for example, from your perspective, me saying no, hi as an up high doesn't make any sense. But you're willing to accept the fact that from my perspective, it somehow makes sense. It's a kind of a paradox. You don't know how to resolve it, but it is a paradox. And paradox, as Richard Feynman put it, is a conflict between reality and what we expect reality to be. And when we reframe a problem as a paradox, it's very uncomfortable because we don't yet know how to resolve that paradox. We're willing to say, I feel uncomfortable and awkward, but I'm not going to solve it immediately. And that's going to feel a bit uncomfortable. In fact, we experience something called dissonance, which is this idea of holding two conflicting viewpoints or emotions at the same time. So how do we overcome this? What's a simple way in that case, instead of blaming me for being weird, what can you do to resolve the situation?
Just ask you where you meant that.
Absolutely. You can engage me in a conversation, right? As simple as it may sound, that's exactly what we can do. We don't always do this, but we can do this. So when you engage me in a conversation, you said, Slim, that's interesting. Why did you say hi as an up high? And I would go, oh, I'm sorry. It's just that it's been so long since I've met you. I didn't know what to say. I just wanted to crack a stupid joke, and that's the only joke that I could come up with. I feel really awkward now. I'm really sorry. Now, when you hear that, does that resolve the paradox for you? As simple and naive, perhaps, but it does resolve the paradox. And as simple as this might be, that's the essence of an insight. When you're resolving that paradox in relation to another, right, that you don't quite understand yet. And what's interesting is that this insight is gotten by the process known as bisociation. And bisociation is a word coined by a novelist, where he said it's a collision, a fusion, or a confrontation of two independent matrices of perception or reasoning. It's basically saying two things that don't seem like they would connect, but somehow they do. That's a bisociation. So when you realize empathy, you cannot not experience bisociation. And Arthur Koestler argued that this lay at the core of all creative processes, this idea of bisociation. And this sort of returns us back to consonance, where we feel okay. And if you think about it, this is exactly what happened in the story of me and my friend, and also when I learned how to draw. But it's not simply a matter of receiving and learning something new. There's also something else happening, which is that I'm trying to reflect back that understanding. I'm trying to express. So in the story of me and my friend, I was trying to say the story or tell her why she was feeling the way she was. In the beginning, I was saying the most obvious thing, which didn't really work. But then through conversation, I kept changing the story over and over and over again. And eventually, it got to a point where I ended up with a story that I didn't expect, but were somehow obvious in hindsight. It connected things that I didn't know they could be connected. But what's even more interesting is that in the story of me and my friend, I actually framed that story as a kind of an offer. It was something that I was giving my friend. Right? So if we come back to this situation, now you knowing how I was feeling and what exactly I was kind of going through at that moment, is there an offer that you can make to me that you think will be mutually meaningful and valuable? And anybody else could answer if they want to. An offer.
You mean like an offer to make you feel less awkward?
You could do that. Whatever you believe is more mutually meaningful and valuable.
I guess what I would say is, well, it's been 15 years, so I'm guessing anything is appropriate.
Sure. Well, maybe we'll go talk about it, play catch up or something like that, right? And a simple offer like that actually contains the essence of what we call innovation. Because innovation, I think a lot of people think innovation is inventing some crazy new thing. But it's actually something that's new, but it must be meaningful and valuable to the context in which it's being introduced to. So if you don't understand how others are feeling, needing, and wanting, simply presenting something new is insufficient. So you cannot innovate until you realize empathy. It can be at a smaller scale, like between friends, or it could be at a larger scale. The only difference is scale, not the quality. So when somebody is presented with a piece of innovation, they're inevitably going to feel both surprise and gratitude. If those two things are not felt, it's very difficult to qualify it as an innovation. So to recap, when you go through a process of realizing empathy, here you can resolve conflict, you acquire insight, you experience creativity, you learn new choices of being impressed and expressing, produce innovation, develop knowledge, and you also form a deeper bond of trust because you get to know them more. Now, any questions up until that point?
Does the innovation fall under the resonance part?
Well, resonance is the quality that you feel when you're encountering a resonance, innovation.
So is that a yes or no?
In a yes, in a sense that,
The innovation part. I'm just looking at this
yes,
graph.
yes,
So it's a yes.
yeah, yeah, sure. So now going back to this graph, let's focus on the conversation piece, because that's what I want to focus on in terms of the creative process. Because any kind of creative process, whether you're interacting with raw materials, if you're a physical visual artist, or if you're a performing artist interacting with your own body parts, or if you're a writer interacting with words, or if you're just in a normal human relationship with other people, there's always a kind of conversation that's happening to facilitate the creative process. And in order for that process to be smoother, I would argue that it has to be empathic. Now, what do I mean by that? There are actually 4 principles or 4 qualities or processes that are interacting and interrelated in what I call the empathic conversation. And they're respecting, listening, considering, and acting. And I'll go through them one by one. So respecting is a word that's often used in art school in relation to raw materials. And specifically in the case of a class I took in blowing glass. Has anyone blown glass before? Okay. So glass was one of the materials that I've had the most interesting time working with because it was the most different, difficult, and unpredictable material I've ever worked with. And one of the projects we did, I took glass and I took a dictionary. And I selected a number of verbs, and I wanted to apply them to glass one by one. So verbs like to fold, to bend, to roll. And one of the verbs was to tear. Now, can you imagine tearing a piece of glass? Now, when you take a glass out of the furnace, it comes out molten. So it just keeps on stretching. And if you tear it, it just heals right back up and hides any sign of tear. So it was enormously difficult for me to try and tear glass. But me and my partner went through hoops trying to make it work. And we eventually got to this piece. And I was extremely proud of myself. I was like, hell yeah, I tore some glass. So I ran to the critic and said, look at this amazing piece of artwork. I tore glass. You know how this is going to turn out. So the critic looked at me funny, and she said, Slim, I think what you did is you tried to make glass look torn as if it were a piece of paper. And I paused for a second and said, you're right. That's exactly what I did. Because the moment I heard the word to tear, I immediately associated with an image of a torn piece of paper. And the entire time, I was simply trying to project that image onto glass. That's all I was trying to do. I never engaged in any kind of conversation with glass. In fact, I blamed it for being difficult, different, and unpredictable. Now, here's a counterexample of an artist who does the exact opposite. So there's an artist by the name of Youngju Kim who plays with velcro. It's about as mundane a material you can possibly use. She makes sculptural objects out of velcro. And this is one of the works that she's made. It's all made of velcro. And this is, in fact, wearable. So you can put it on a person, and it looks like this. Now, can you see the difference in the approach? The kind of respect she has for materials? The kind of respect that I lacked? Now, when we use the word respect, we often use it as a synonym for tolerating or accommodating. We say, oh, I respectfully disagree. What we really mean is like, well, you're wrong, but I'm nice. So I'll let you have your opinion. Right? That's not respect. When you look the Latin root for respect, it's to look back at. And you'd be like, what does looking have anything to do with respect? But if you think about what just happened, looking, or how you choose to look, has everything and anything to do with respect. And whenever you have trouble realizing empathy, one of the signs is that if you feel, you have to realize that whenever you're looking at the other, you're not looking at them for who they are or what they are. You're looking at them the way you want to. And whenever they seem weird, it's because you expect them to be something else. But there's always a different angle from which to look at that other, where that weirdness will no longer seem so weird. Second word, or second process, is listening. And obviously this is a word I got from that psychiatrist. but it was also a word that's often used in carpentry. So one day I was in a wood shop, and it was maybe about 3 times the size of this room. It's a large wood shop. And I was over here using a Japanese handsaw to saw some piece of wood to make furniture. And in case you're curious what Japanese handsaw sounds like, so that's a Japanese handsaw. So I was sawing away, and a carpenter monitoring the wood shop, maybe about 50 feet away, starts yelling at me. He says, "You over there, stop doing that." And I'm like, "Why?" "Well, because you're not listening to the wood." And I'm like, "What do you mean, not listening to the wood?" And he just kind of shakes his head and starts walking over. And he says, "You have to realize that wood is extremely honest. If you're only willing to listen, it will tell you how you're doing." And I was like, "Okay, Zen Master, I have no idea what you're talking about." And he comes all the way near me and says, "Watch this." And he unclamps the wood I've been sawing, lowers it down, reclamps it, and says, "Do it again." And I do it again. And this is how the sound changed. The problem was that I had clamped the wood a bit too high. So every time I would saw, it would wobble a bit. And it was making a lot of rumbling noise. But I swear to God, I had heard that sound. But I did not know that it meant it was a rumbling noise. There's a subtle distinction between hearing and listening that is quite profound here. And it has to do with meaning. So when we use the word hear, we think it's just about perceiving signals, that somehow signals have meaning, which could not be further from the truth. We're people who make meaning from any random signals that we encounter. Right? And we're doing this whether we like it or not. So when you're listening, you're proactively trying to do this in a very, very active manner. It's like the difference between just getting wet because it's raining versus you go out to get wet because you want to. And it's raining. In one of the interviews I did in the book, a child psychologist had this wonderful story about how babies mature. And he said, the baby's world is sometimes defined by the senses, the touch, the smell, the sight, the experience of mother, let's say. So when they hear a footstep, they're going to expect mother to show up, naturally. But there will be a day when they hear a footstep and somebody else will show up. And they'll be surprised. You'll be like, "Oh, who is this person? I was expecting mother." But what's interesting is that at that very moment, the baby has an opportunity to reflect and say, "Are there 2 different kinds of footsteps? I didn't know." Are you saying that if I listen more carefully, there are subtle nuances and differences in what I used to think it only has one meaning? Have you ever had a chance to read a book when you're 10 years old, and you read it the same exact book when you're 20, and it meant something very different? And you read it again in 10 years, and when you're 30, again, means something different. This happens over and over again. Did the book change? No, the book's the same. You changed. You're making meaning differently because you've matured, because you've learned. This is at the core of how we learn new things. So the first 2, respecting and listening, you could think about it as being part of that first part, the first choice, the being impressed, learning how to be impressed. These other 2 are really more about how to express by reflecting on that impression. So considering is a word that's quite often used in visual design. So in one of the classes I took in typography, we were told to make a large poster, about 20 inches by 30 inches. And it was a large poster because we had to shove in about 60 different pieces of information. It's a lot of information to put in even on a poster that size. But the instructor said, I don't want you to just organize information. I want you to make the poster such that people can have an aesthetic experience when they're in front of this poster. And I said, well, how do you do that? And he said, well, there's many different kinds of experiences. You choose what you want to be able to share. But some tips I can tell you. And the tip is learn how to push things to the foreground and pull things into the background. And I said, oh, okay. I kind of nodded, pretending to know. Because when he said those words, foreground and background, this is the first image that popped in my head. So, oh yeah, I know. White, black, it's sort of like playing with what's in the front, what's in the back. Yeah, I get it. So I spent the next 2 months trying to make a poster using that technique, trying to play with black and white, but I went nowhere. Poster after poster, I couldn't even organize the image or the information, let alone have some kind of an aesthetic experience. But then one day I came across a picture. And as I was staring into this picture, I had a kind of an experience. An experience where I felt as I was being drawn into the picture. There was a kind of a three-dimensionality, a depth, a quality that I can perceive when I was in front of this picture. And I said, oh, okay, maybe this is what he was talking about, an aesthetic experience. But then it also occurred to me that maybe when he said foreground and background, he didn't just mean black and white. He actually meant that if I designed the poster just right, I can actually push things into 3 dimensions in whatever way I want. So at that moment, I scrapped the poster I've been making for 2 months, and I made a brand new one that looked like this. It's kind of hard to see, but I was able to organize all the information and still retain that quality of 3-dimensionality as the aesthetic experience I wanted to afford. So if you think about what happened between me and my professor, we were using the same language, namely English, to describe 2 different experiences. My experience of foreground and background was that black and white image. He had a separate experience. It wasn't until we had a shared experience that was similar enough, that we finally had a metaphor. His words were no longer just a word, but it actually had meaning to me that was concrete and experiential. And when I could finally understand him, I can use that understanding as a reference with which I could make a poster. So every single design decision I made was centered around the idea of how can I share this experience of 3-dimensionality with my audience. It's a very different kind of consideration. And if you think about it, the same thing happened in the drawing class. Every single mark I made of darkness was not an arbitrary mark. It was about the idea that if I make a dark mark here, that hopefully would relate to your experience of darkness in real life and make that connection such that you can also experience the sense of depth, the sense of 3-dimensionality, as you're looking at a flat piece of paper. And this is the kind of consideration we're talking about, where you're trying to connect 2 experiences, your own and the other person's. Now, have you ever had a chance to get a gift that you just didn't like? And you felt obliged to say thank you, but you really didn't mean it? This is the kind of consideration. When you consider another, you're not just unilaterally doing things. You're considering that person's context and try to figure out what kind of action, what kind of mark making, what kind of expression would be meaningful to that other context. Final one is acting. And this is the word I blatantly stole from theater. Because I was taking an acting class, and we were rehearsing for a play called The Streetcar Named Desire. Does anybody not know the play? Oh, wow, okay, fantastic. So obviously there's the hyper-masculine Butch Stanley character and the hyper-delicate female character, Blanche. And two of my friends were up on stage rehearsing for a scene where Stanley was accusing Blanche of lying. Kind of a difficult scene to act. And I'd seen the movie version of this the night before, where Marlon Brando and Vivian Leigh were playing these roles. And I was kind of comparing that to how my friends were doing. And my friends were sucking pretty bad. And I was being extremely judgmental, because bad acting is really hard to watch. So I was kind of waiting for the director to stop them, and lo and behold, she stopped them. And the director said, "Okay, Blanche, what's going through your mind as you're acting this role?" And she said, "Well, I'm trying to put myself in her situation. This is what I would do in that situation." The director said, "Oh, okay, interesting. How do you think Blanche is feeling?" And my friend said, "Defensive?" The director said, "Okay, interesting. What else?" And my friend said, "Vulnerable?" The director said, "Interesting. Have you been in front of another man that made you feel so vulnerable that you feel you have to defend yourself?" My friend paused for a second. And then she said, "Yes." And the entire room went silent. And the director started asking more questions. What was the day like? Was it hot or cold? What was the color of the guy's skin? How tall was he? You don't have to answer out loud. Just remember what it was like. And before I know it, my friend begins to weep. The director says, "Okay, take that with you and say the lines." And as difficult as this must have been for my friend, she does it. And what came out was a brilliant performance. Something completely different from how it was done a moment ago. And also completely different from the way it was done in the movie version. Yet, it somehow just felt right. Now, what I realized at that moment was the entire time I thought acting was pretending to tell somebody else's story. But no, it turns out acting is to tell your story. Well, of course, the name of the actor or the name of the character or the context, all those things are not yours. But the experience is all yours. And when this kind of sincere honesty is expressed, we as audience cannot help but feel a profound sense of resonance. Because despite all the superficial differences we might have, we realize that there's something we share, a quality, a shared humanity. And that's what acting was all about. So those four things, respecting, listening, considering, and acting, they're happening throughout this process that I described as learning to be impressed and reflecting on that so we can express it. Think of it like breathing. You breathe in, and you kind of pause, and then you breathe out. There's kind of a rhythm and flow to this process. And to guide this process are the kinds of principles of respecting, listening, considering, and acting. So to quickly recap, to respect is to look differently. To listen is to make new meaning. To consider is to make shared metaphors. And to act is to be sincerely honest. Now, what really starts to back these up is, I believe, two different attitudes that are really the same, two sides of the same coin. And I think they're humility and courage. And humility is about saying, I don't know. Without that, you can't quite respect, nor can you quite listen. But at the same time, you still have to consider an act, which is actually a kind of a form of making a decision, making a choice. And when you do those things at the same time, what you give rise to is a sense of resilient curiosity. Not just any kind of curiosity, but the resilient kind, where you're willing to keep trying. Without this, it would be very difficult to realize empathy. And I'll tell a final story to end. And that's a story of the friend that I just talked about. And she came back for a final project and decided to sing. And she decided to sing a song about that very man she remembered on stage to play Blanche. So there she was, in her own being, telling literally this time her own story of who this man was and how she was emotionally and physically wounded in her relationship to this man. And there were 20 of us, her peers, watching this. It was one of the most courageous acts I've ever seen. But I want you to take a moment to think about what inspired her to tell her story. Because I believe it's her experience empathizing with another, namely Blanche. Now, can you remember a time in your own life where you tried to empathize with another actually helped you empathize with yourself to better understand yourself? Think of a time when you were trying to write really clear for other people, and it actually helped you better understand what it is that you're thinking. Remember a time when you tried really hard to teach somebody something, and that actually helped you better understand the material that you try to teach. And in all the stories I told, all these times when trying to go through the creative process, it helped me better understand what I was missing. And I think this is what makes realizing empathy intrinsically reciprocal. Not reciprocal in the sense of exchanging gifts or favors, but in the sense of the act of trying to realize empathy with another is in and of itself an act of receiving. And to me, this is the cardiac cycle of any meaningful relationships. It's neither selfish nor altruistic. It's simply a loop that cannot be untangled without losing its meaning. I think this is one of the most beautiful loops I've ever encountered in the course of what I now think about the creative process. So if you have any instances in your own life, in any interaction with any other, that you wish were more creative, doesn't have to be painting, could be just with another friend. I want you to remember this quality that we talked about tonight and find out how you can make any interaction empathic. And in doing so, give rise to a lot of the creativity that's imbued in that sense of empathy. Thank you.
We've got about 6 minutes, so we could take a couple questions.
Sure. Has anybody? Yes.
It's implied here, I guess.